Okay, so I'm going to introduce Zamir, who's one of our BALA representatives. He's going to give us opening remarks. First off, thank you to all of our participants, all of you and our panelists for joining us. I'm very appreciative that we can come together and hold space right now to collectively process the tremendous violence that Black communities and communities of color are experiencing in multiple ways, from the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on Black and Latinx communities to the rise in anti-Asian violence and to the ongoing police violence and brutality against Black communities. I want to acknowledge the work of our union comrades, particularly Black attorneys, who have been leading this fight both at Legal Aid and in broader kind of movements for justice for the communities that we serve and for some of us that we're part of, right? And so thank you to BALA for organizing the public defender protests earlier this week on Monday and all of the other actions that our union comrades have been involved with. And so I want to hand it over to Zamir, who is one of our BALA representatives, and he's going to give us his opening remarks. Thanks, Zamir.
Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who do not know me, my staff attorney in the Brooklyn Community Justice Unit, and I'm also one of the representatives of the Black Attorneys of Legal Aid Caucus, which is one of 3 diversity caucuses of ALAA. Our caucus was formed with the dual aim of advocating for Black attorneys within the legal aid society and fighting anti-Black racism in the United States in the ways that we can. And given what has transpired over the past few weeks, you can imagine how occupied we've been. I'm very grateful to the Attorneys of Color of Legal Aid, or ACLA, both for having this event and for extending an invitation for us to speak briefly. It is unfortunate that historically, groups of color in America have been pitted against each other and fought against each other. It's unfortunate because in actuality, we have more in common than we might think. This is particularly true for the African American and Asian American communities in this country. We live in a society that was designed to benefit white people. So if you are not white, then the system is not for you. Even worse is that both groups have fallen victim to the system's ever-present ability to divide and conquer. I hope the day comes when marginalized groups in America will realize the commonalities they have, shed themselves of the Eurocentric perceptions of themselves and of each other, and will band together to fight the system that harms each of them individually and collectively. Again, we thank ACLA for having us, and we hope that everybody finds this event productive. And with that, I'll turn it back to the panel.
Thank you, Samir. Okay, so I'm going to transition us now into the panel discussion and just to give people a sense of how we came to organizing this event. Thank you to ACLA for organizing. And originally the conception of the event was to do something for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And in thinking about planning a discussion around the docuseries that PBS did. And then obviously with the recent events with police violence and also the uprising and the Black Lives Matter movement, we felt like it was important to transition this discussion into a moment to think about what it means for Asian Americans to do racial justice work, to struggle in solidarity with Black communities, and how we can kind of bring that conversation back into legal aid, into the places that we work, into the legal community, because these struggles are intertwined and we can't just put the movement at the door. We have to bring that into the work that we do every day. So in terms of why we're having this conversation, as you all know, on May 25th, George Floyd became the latest face of Black Lives Matter. In addition to a white officer pressing his knee on George Floyd's neck, there was an Asian American officer standing by who refused to intervene despite the pleas of bystanders. For my fellow Asian Americans, we don't get to look away or make this simply a Black and white issue. Both literally and as a metaphor, what happened to George Floyd should tell us that this is all of our issue and our silence is complicity, is death. In the past couple of weeks, people and organizations are amplifying Black Lives Matter and how we need to speak up. The outpouring of Asian American voices condemning police violence contrasts sharply with the police killing of Akai Gurley at the hands of Chinese American NYPD officer Peter Liang. Maybe that's growth. And if it is, it's the product of Black-led struggle, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the generations of prison abolition organizing, and the Black liberation struggle, and all of the organizing that's being done in solidarity with non-Black people of color and our white allies. So the Attorneys of Color at Legal Aid, ACLA, presents this panel to help us unpack and explore how we can think about this moment, as well as what we need to do to make sure that the ways we are challenging racism goes beyond trying to change individual attitudes, but instead will lead to dismantling, transforming the systems that reproduce racism and harm, particularly towards Black communities. Through this discussion, we also hope to challenge a whitewashed narrative of history that racializes Asian Americans as the model minority and uses us as a racial wedge against Black communities, and to reckon with relational racial privilege for those of us who are non-Black people of color. Both in the panel discussion and in the portion after, during the Q&A, we look forward to hearing from our panelists and all of you on what building cross-racial solidarity looks like. How do we approach racial conflict and divide and conquer politics that unfolds between communities of color? And also share concrete steps and strategies we can individually and collectively take in this moment and beyond. And so I'd like to introduce our panelists, which include Mitchell Esteller, who's the ACLA co-representative. He's a staff attorney in the Decarceration Project. Naila Siddiqui, who's a staff attorney in Manhattan Criminal Defense Practice. Jinbin Wong, staff attorney in the Cop Accountability Project. And for those of you who don't know me, I am one of the trustees for the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, and I'm a staff attorney in the Housing Justice Unit Group Advocacy Project in the Harlem Community Law Office. So to start us off, I'd like to ask the panelists if you can share a little bit about yourselves and how you're entering this conversation, and really what you would like us to think about as we get started in this broader conversation. So any of you can jump in. You can share any, either personal anecdote, a broader kind of political point, whatever you would like to share with the rest of us. Thank you.
Okay, I will start. I was going to share an anecdote, but I think I actually want to just talk a little bit about how this is an ongoing education for myself as well, that I'm always going to try to be better. And I want to thank my friends at this office who have been really great to bounce ideas off of, and to have these kind of have these hard conversations with, and how much I appreciate having that safe space to be able to do so. I hope that this is a jumping off point for many of us to continue to have conversations with each other, and to help each other really educate ourselves a little bit better about these kind of.
Mitchell or Naila, do either of you want to share anything about kind of what you're bringing into this conversation, either from your own personal experience, how you view your political identity, just to kind of kick us off and give people a better sense of how you're approaching this conversation?
Mitchell, do you want to go, or I can?
Yeah, so I'm entering this conversation with a heavy heart, but I'm also really hopeful as to what could happen down the line, right? Especially with what happened today with the executive order. And there seems to be like a lot in terms of a silver lining, but I'm not gonna be holding my breath. I think I'm coming into this space very angry and also just ashamed as to the complicit nature of my world, my life. And I think it's time that we all just hold each other accountable for anything and everything.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would just want to echo the points that were just made. I do feel like somewhat hopeful in terms of, I mean, just the fact that the notion to defund the police has become mainstream. That's something I don't know that I would have ever imagined. And then just coming into, this conversation about Asian Americans for Black lives, and my own identity being a child of immigrants, South Asian American who was raised Muslim, and how that formed my racial identity. I grew up in a predominantly white suburb in upstate New York. You sort of had you know, if you weren't white, you were sort of other. And as a kid, you didn't really have deep conversations about race. You just knew you weren't white, as did the other non-white folks. And there was sort of solidarity around that. And then also growing up Muslim, I was actually fortunate enough to go to a mosque that was fairly diverse, where we had Arabs, South Asians, Black Americans, Africans, and it was very diverse. So being growing up in a suburb that was predominantly white, and then having like Sunday school with a very diverse community, but not really understanding what that meant until I got to college, where, you know, took a lot of sociology classes. It was a time where, you know, social deconstruction was a thing. And then I graduated right before 9/11. And so how South Asian Americans, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans came into a conversation of sort of, I guess, policing, and, you know, entered into a moment of racism for them in that time.
Yeah, thank you, Naila. I think for all of us, we bring a lot of lived experiences and community struggles with us, and we each come from different backgrounds. And whether, you know, for me, as someone who is queer and also Chinese American, I think about the need for intersectional solidarity. I think about how we need to connect different movements. It's not to say that we're all experiencing racism or oppression in the same ways, but there are things that we can learn across identities and communities and experiences. And so I appreciate you kind of uplifting the part around South Asian identity and racialization, especially post 9/11. And I think, you know, similarly for other kind of marginalized Asian American groups, including Southeast Asians and Filipinx communities, there's also a lot of underrepresentation and marginalization that exists in those communities that plays out in different ways when we think about poverty and which communities are existing with other marginalized communities, right? And so thinking about how racialized poverty looks even in New York City, how when we talk about problems with the public school system, we're talking about Black, Latinx, and also Asian American students. And so I think there's a lot that we can think about across experiences and marginalization, both drawing parallels, but also understanding the nuances and differences across communities. And so I don't know if any of you want to uplift anything else in this moment. I heard also, you know, in our prior talks, we talked a little bit about like defunding the NYPD or calls for prison abolition. You know, I heard, you know, other comments around the need for learning and to think about that as a continuous process. I think about, you know, what Angela Davis, you know, her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And then obviously the kind of broader questions around allyship. And so what does Asians for Black Lives mean to each of you? What does South Asians for Black Lives mean to you? What does that mean to you? And is that a framework that resonates with you? Is that a banner that you feel is important or useful? How do you kind of understand this kind of broader organizing, whether it's through the formal kind of campaign around Asians for Black Lives, where there's a chapter in the Bay Area, to more of like this decentralized moment where a lot of Asian Americans are coming together under this banner of Asians for Black
Lives? So I can take that in terms of what does South Asians for Black Lives or look for mean to me specifically. I mean, being a public defender and through the work, I do support, you know, the movement for Black lives. And what does solidarity look like? I think as a South Asian woman, knowing that I do have certain privileges, while I am not white, I do have privileges. And I think solidarity and allyship means struggling with those privileges, learning from and being supportive of the movement for Black lives, centering, you know, Black voices, and supporting it, like supporting Black-led movements, especially in this moment. And I think an ally is showing up for and doing whatever you can. I know we're also in a pandemic, so showing up for and supporting, uplifting Black voices, but also talking to people in our own community, whether it be family members, other community members, and organizations, about what anti-Black racism is.
What I see as Asians for Black Lives is the understanding and the recognition that we as Asians have benefited from the various social justice movements that have been led by and with the Black community. There's a recognition that the very foundation of identity politics with the Asian diaspora is necessarily intimately linked with Black lives and Black Lives movement, right? And I think it's also the realization that the model minority myth is just that. It's just like another tool by which we are divided and separated from each other so as to alleviate the oppressors from any sense of guilt or wrongdoing. And I do want to just address the entire concept of like yellow peril supports Black power. I do recall you, Jason, at the beginning talking about the Kai Gurley situation with Peter Liang. You say that it's growth, but this has happened already in 1992 in LA, right before like the Rodney King situation, where like a 16-year-old Black girl was shot and killed by a Korean store owner, right? She was sentenced to 5 years probation, despite the fact that she killed an innocent Black girl. And the entire dichotomy in responses from the Asian community was problematic then, and it's kind of still problematic now. I think there's been a shift in the tide in terms of the mentality and the framework that people approach it now, but I don't think that it's improved that much. But as I said earlier, I do still somewhat remain hopeful despite this anger.
Related to that, Mitchell, I was thinking about those situations and about how Asians have been and how minorities are pitted against each other, and how with that particular situation, there was a lot of tension between the Korean community, the Black community, and rightly so for events that happened, but also there was sort of a unjustified anger in a way about the looting that happened in Koreatown, because I think that now we can look back at it and see that one of the reasons why what happened in Koreatown wasn't just about the uprising, or not the uprising, but like the reaction of the community, the rightful anger about what happened to Rodney King. But one of the reasons why Koreatown was allowed to burn was because they were also being ignored by leadership and government, and that it's basically what I'm trying to get at here is that I think we need to continue to have conversations within our community, that when we look at what we're angry about with the system, that we stop trying to blame each other or say that it's the fault of, or that there's a tension between Black and Asians, but to really look at what the root causes of our injustices are really coming from. Like, for example, in that situation, the root cause of some of the injustices that happened, how the Korean community was left out in the cold, really had to do with the government just not caring about what happened to them because they had no political power, and so Koreatown was left to burn. And for the Asian community to understand the rightful anger that is felt when there is an unjustified murder of someone in their community. I think that the conversation has gotten somewhat better, although it is wrought with some tension.
Yeah, these are all really great points. The way I look at it, I agree with you, Mitchell. I think there's still a lot of problems. Asian American kind of broadly examined. I will say that from what I've seen regarding the response in Minneapolis, that the officer who was involved with George Floyd's death and killing was a Hmong American, and in the aftermath of that, from what I saw, a lot of the Hmong community really mobilized to express their support for Black Lives Matter and to demand accountability of their fellow Hmong American police officer. And that to me is a very different response than what we've seen here in New York City regarding the Chinese American community mobilizing in support and defense of Peter Liang. And I want to just name that, you know, there was one of the narratives that came out of the organizing in Minneapolis is a mother who's Hmong, from the Hmong community, and her son was killed by the police department there. And it was the Black community that stood in solidarity with her and the Hmong American community to demand justice and accountability for her and for her son who was killed. And I think that legacy, that history of solidarity between the Hmong American community, which is a very marginalized and minoritized small population in a predominantly white city and state, allowed for, to me, maybe more of a sense of solidarity and understanding regarding how racism and white supremacy functions in our society in a way that maybe in New York City in this current kind of moment doesn't quite exist because of the ways in which you know, we can look at intersectional kind of privilege that exists among the Asian American community and among the Chinese American community. And so I think it's also important to name that not all Asian Americans are the same, not all Asian Americans respond to police brutality in the same way, not all of them experience police brutality in the same way. And I also think about, you know, this young, I think Vietnamese American teenager who was shot in Washington, or maybe it was in Seattle, and the officer killed him and said that they thought he had a gun and he was holding a pen and he was about to graduate from high school. And, you know, for that particular case, I think about how perhaps that Vietnamese American boy was racialized as Black and brown in that moment, right? And so in the ways in which we think about Asian Americans in proximity to whiteness, there's also Asian American proximity to Blackness. And that also impacts how our communities experience
proximity within
white supremacy.
Proximity within each other, right? So let me ask you guys this. How do you identify yourselves when somebody asks you, what are you? And not just like the smart ass response that you want to give, right? But like, do you identify as an Asian American, or do you identify as something more specific and identifiable than that?
I mean, so I identify as South Asian American, mostly because I feel like Asian American is a very broad, you know, and like, I mean, just on this panel, we're Asian American and we have completely, you know, we're not the same. But also what I just want to touch on what Jason said about the Hmong community, and I'm not super familiar, but I was reading some articles recently, how they are predominantly a refugee community, which is completely different from the notion of the model minority, where it was professionals or, you know, college educated, you know, people from Asia coming over, like the professional migration, where the model minority myth stems from. And I think that in terms of with the Hmong community support and also experience with race and racism in Minneapolis, probably stems from a forced migration situation and I guess navigating through what I imagine to be a very white space, you know, and so understanding it in that context, and then going back to, you know, Asian Americans are not a monolith, you know, clearly, but.
Is it really clearly?
I would just also add that, you know, just like I wanted to uplift that example, in New York City, there's also been a history of Black and Asian organizing against police brutality, right? And so even in New York City in the 80s and 90s, there have been police violence against Chinese Americans. And it's also the Black community that has stood in solidarity with organizations like CAB. And even now, organizations like CAB and DRUM, DC's Rising Up and Moving, they're working together and to build solidarity and to demand justice in ways that goes beyond kind of the limited reforms that we often hear about, but really thinking about how we can transform these systems. But to answer your question, Mitchell, like I identify as Asian American because for me, there's an understanding of Asian American as a political identity and the ways in which we're racialized as Asian American here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so that comes out of the 60s and 70s and kind of the movement around ethnic studies and third world solidarity, mostly based in California. But for me, that's kind of how I orient myself. But I also identify as Chinese American because I know that that's also my community, and that's where that is the community that I also need to do organizing in and to also hold my people accountable.
It's funny that you should use the word orient yourself, considering like that was the basis by which like this term was even like created, right? Like to make sure that we are not the rugs that you step on. I am not an Oriental. Okay.
Jen, did you want to?
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to answer your question, Mitchell, I do identify myself as Asian American, but it's really funny because I think that sometimes I guess sometimes it does depend on who's asking me. Mm-hmm. If it's someone who is also a minority, sometimes I'll make that qualifying statement that I am Chinese American, and even go further than that, and sometimes we'll even say, you know, my family's from Hong Kong. And that is, again, sort of this example of this, like, the different layers of you know, racism, or I guess, or like classism that's happening, right? Because there's a distinction that sometimes people, even within Chinese community, want to make about what part of the Chinese community are they from. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers the question 100%, but that's, yeah.
Well, I think that just goes into how like our identities, especially like, you know, if a South Asian person asks me where you're from and I say South Asia, that's not where they're getting at. They're kind of trying to figure out what country I'm from. And, you know, like it just like, or, you know, and if someone who's white is asking me where I'm from, it's, you know, it depends, but it goes into how complex our identities are in a fairly racialized world.
Yeah, I think like all of these points, it goes to how like racialization and racial identity is so much situated within a particular political context and historical moment. And so it looks different between, you know, interpersonal conversation with someone who's of the quote unquote same racial background, but also, you know, thinking about like during the Japanese internment that there were Chinese Americans who said, we're not Japanese. Or, you know, there's other kind of moments where there's Asian Americans differentiating themselves from other Asian Americans as a response to anti-Asian racism and violence. So I think that that's another thing to just think about, that there's all of these intergroup distinctions as well, in addition to kind of interracial differences that we've been talking about more broadly. So I wanted to kind of go back and build on a little bit of what I think I heard Mitchell and Jonathan also saying about the idea of Black and Asian conflict. And so we talked a little bit about Latasha Harlins and the LA riots or uprising, and you know, also the ways in which communities are pitted against each other. And so could you elaborate, any of you, on how you see that narrative of conflict playing out? Is that, you know, is it to say that there isn't conflict, or is there conflict? How do we understand conflict between people of color, between Black and Asian communities and other communities of color more broadly? Like, how do we think about this?
I think that there's always been a little bit of a tension, and part of it has got to be because of the narrative that like mainstream media has put out oftentimes, trying to pit minorities against each other. And this historical context of, like you said, Mitchell, earlier, the model minority. The model minority was something that was used like very specifically to put a wedge, to be a wedge amongst people of color, so that we weren't able to collectively stand together in solidarity. The point was to separate us, and the point was to pit us against each other in a way. I think that we need to continue to have conversations with each other to confront that, because while, for example, I have Asian friends who I feel I've had to confront about their anti-Blackness, and I've had to do it in a careful way, but I also knew that I had to do it. And I think that that's part of what we have to do within our own communities, right? We have to hold ourselves to account. We have to hold our community to account. And that tension is, I mean, I guess what I want to say about this tension is that, like, as an Asian American, I think that one of the things that I've had to talk about with my other Asian American friends who might have anti-Blackness is to talk about how we are and we can be victims of racism and also be utilized as agents of a racist system ourselves. And so we have to be cognizant of that and aware of that and be able to confront that in order to overcome that.
Yeah, I just wanted to pull out what you just said about kind of how the model minority myth is used to pit communities of color against each other. And I want to underscore that, at least for me, I think of that particularly, that being used to perpetuate anti-Black racism, right? So the goal is not just to divide, but that it was used specifically to push back against civil rights and affirmative action and policies and programs that were being demanded by the Black liberation movement. And so, you know, how do we do that? We undercut the Black struggle by saying, you know, well, if Asian Americans can do it, then why can't they? And so feeding into, you know, notions of rugged individualism and the rise of the conservative movement and all of those kind of things. And so I think it's also really important to just name that the foundation of the model minority myth is racist towards Asian Americans, but it's also used and weaponized to perpetuate anti-Black racism. So
yeah, so in actually preparing for this and also just like doing my reading, there was a quote that I found from the former Assistant Secretary of Labor back in 1966, Daniel Moynihan, who had defended his statement and his claim that the too strong emphasis on matriarchy in Black culture was to blame for the same charged comparison that at a time when it is being proposed that hundreds of billions be spent to uplift Negroes and other minorities, the nation's 300,000 Chinese Americans are moving ahead on their own with no help from anyone else. Like that's ingrained in the history of this fucking country, right? And even before then, there's also case law that talks about, like, even though Chinese Americans and anybody else who is from Asian countries are not specified as those who are, whose testimony cannot be given credit to be admissible in trial, despite the fact that they are not specifically listed, they are still excluded from being counted. So even though we're not the ones being subjected to or subjugated, we are still never the ones who count or the ones who matter.
Well, and also just, I mean, going back to the model minority, like the myth, or like, I mean, it's used specifically to divide people at the same time, like Asian Americans in US history, like the Japanese internment, like that did happen. Asian Americans were seen as the other. 9/11, that did happen. I do think, tensions between communities will always exist, and the process of us all coming together will be a struggle. And I think that it's definitely a commitment for each and every one of us to sort of, go back to not just our friends, but our own families to talk about this, because, everyone's, like our parents who immigrated here came alone and had to build up whatever they had to build up. And so, they're going to take pride in that, but also just understanding how at any moment they will be enemies of the state. And we've seen that historically. And I also think that going back to, like, in terms of finding solidarity with, Black Lives Matter, is looking into the history and seeing how Asians have been working in solidarity with Black liberation movements, and so, even like Kamala Harris talks about how her Indian mother, protested during the civil rights movement and, things like that. So that did happen. This isn't new, but it's also sort of a tension that will exist. And it is progress when the Hmong community says, stands in solidarity with George Floyd against their own, right? And then also within our own communities, there's going to be tensions, with 9/11, with Sikh Americans being attacked for wearing a turban because people thought they were Muslim, right? And so like within communities, like, you know, Asian communities, South Asian communities, there's always a lot of smaller communities that exist. So it's working through that tension because, like, for example, just looking at like women wearing hijab and, you know, Sikhs wearing like just the headdress, right? You do want people to know what that means, but at the same time, it's not like, don't kill me because I'm Sikh, go after the Muslims. It's, I'm another, you know, it's giving meaning to your identity, which absolutely, but then you also don't want to, you know, you want to talk about sort of the hate that's involved in harming someone for who they are. So,
I should probably specify and clarify this point. I was not born here. I came here when I was 7, 1992, and we moved to a part of Brooklyn that is predominantly, if not entirely, Black. So this concept of communities with which we need to like check each other, I've never actually had to do that up until like college, when the actual depths of racism was thrown in my face when I was in Boston, right? Like that wasn't something like I had actually encountered here in Brooklyn. But yeah.
That's interesting, Mitchell. I grew up in mostly minority majority town, but it was also predominantly like East and South Asian. So like by the time I got to college, there was there were very specific incidents where like I had to start checking some of my friends for saying stuff or doing stuff that I was like, this is a little like off, you know? And so you have, and it's interesting that you said that because it's just like the way that we grow up in the communities that we grow up in can have so much influence on how we approach these issues or when we are forced to confront these issues to begin with.
Yeah, I want us to unpack a little bit more about the conflict, the ways in which conflict is constituted or understood before we move on into unpacking what solidarity looks like. And one of the points that I've heard Dylan Rodriguez and Connie, I think it's Connie One, Dylan's a ethnic studies professor who's Filipinx and also does a lot of prison abolitionist organizing. And what I've heard both of them say in these conversations around Black Asian solidarity is that we have to understand anti-Asian violence within a broader context that anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity makes possible. And so again, anti-Asian violence is only made possible through anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. Because I think it's so important to underscore that, because I think some Asian people or Asian Americans see it as a limited pie of like, well, now is our time to talk about what's happening to us. Or now is our time to fight for school resources for us, for my kids to have the spot at this specialized high school versus Black and Latinx students. And I think that understanding of racism and anti-Asian racism is wrong. I think it's just fundamentally wrong, because we wouldn't be here, Asian Americans wouldn't be here if it was not for the colonization of this land and the enslavement of Africans. We would not be here if it was not for anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity that makes possible for white supremacy to continue to play itself out across racialized bodies. And so I want to open that back up to all of you and just to see like what's your response to that. Does that resonate with you? Do you, in terms of, you know, how you're hearing people sometimes talking about, you know, it is, you know, there is a real conflict, right? That there is a real divide, that we need to fight for our resources or our people. You know, I've been involved with some of the education equity organizing here in New York City, and I've been attacked by fellow Chinese Americans and Asian Americans calling me a race traitor and doing all kinds of stuff. And then also seeing like a lot of fear among Asian Americans who don't want to, so-called progressive Asian Americans who don't want to speak out because they're afraid of that backlash, which is a separate issue. But anyway, so the point is around anti-indigeneity and anti-Blackness, and does that resonate with you as being foundational to how we experience anti-Asian violence? It's a little bit of a rhetorical question, but just wondering if you want to build on that point, feel free to, or if you want to talk more about transition it into the conversation around what solidarity looks like, we can do that too.
I mean, I think it definitely resonates with me. I mean, in terms of like just looking at like the broad, you know, BIPOC, marginalized community struggles, I think violence against any historically marginalized community and liberation for, any colonized, imperialized, and oppressed community is inherently intertwined with the liberation of all of us. And so I think it definitely does resonate with me that way, in that way. And I think for like, I'm sure obviously with other folks.
I mean, like you definitely make like a resounding point, right? But I think that the only instances in which like I hear these remarks and these comments as to situations that are happening is when it impacts the Asian people directly. So they don't actually fully appreciate like the severity of the bullshit unless it impacts them. And it is only then that they want to speak up, and they want to acknowledge how problematic the situations actually are. I think it was last year, like we talked about it the other day, like the entire nail salon situation, right? And how that was entirely a charged situation, that people only spoke up about it once it impacted their community.
And just going into like the nail salon situation, and I think also other like tensions that exist between specific Asian American communities and the Black community, or just tensions that exist. The media does portray it as, what's the word? Like that there is conflict between Asians and the Black community, through the nail salon. And also just, I mean, if you look at, Black men having a difficult time getting hailing a cab, and who, like South Asians were predominantly the cab drivers, right? So there is definitely a lot of anti-Black racism that does exist in our communities, but working through that, and I guess what I mean to say is, there is the media narrative, but there are also moments of solidarity that need to be highlighted, because communities have come together in many instances, and even when those moments happen, because we can't deny, things did happen at the nail salon, things did happen, but using it as a moment for, if it's like a framework of building together, or like some sort of restorative justice or something, as opposed to a media narrative of pitting two communities against each other, where they can find maybe more commonality.
Yeah,
I wanted to go back a little bit about how the Asian American community can often stay silent. And I just wanted to point out that I think that a lot of it has to do with a lot of the issues with, first generation immigration to this country. Like people, our parents came, or my parents at least, they came here with nothing. They didn't know the language very well. They were, on their own. And I think that part of that also instilled in them this like survivalist mentality, and to just put your head down, don't make waves, and you'll be okay. And I think that if we can start getting people to understand that that survivalist mentality is actually self-defeating and is actually harmful to our communities, then we can also start talking about why solidarity actually makes more sense than just putting our heads down and not saying anything, or only saying something when it affects our community, because it's this survivalist mentality that actually isn't. It's just self-defeating for our progress as well.
Right?
Well,
yeah, and it's isolating.
I think the only way for us to actually achieve the survival aspect and this objective is to be in solidarity with everybody else who's also being subjected to.
Yeah.
Well, and also
exactly.
Survivalist mentality exists because you're always being told that this is not your home, right? Like,
yeah.
When you have immigrants coming here and just trying to like, okay, I don't want to rock the boat. It's your position here is always at risk, right? Like if you're not a citizen, at any moment you could be deported. If you're just a green card holder, at any moment you could be deported. And And so it is very self-defeating, because then you're not working to, assert your own rights and expand those. And that's also why, I think going back to like if you're operating in a survivalist mentality and your position is, you don't belong, you're not liberated. And so your liberation is intertwined again with the marginalization and oppression of other communities, specifically the Black community.
Yeah.
I think the way all three of you are kind of reframing how we understand racism is what I'm hearing you're doing, so that, we're told that racism is kind of the interpersonal conflict between individuals who are Black and Asian at a nail salon, in a moment where you're trying to catch a cab, in the community at the liquor store, and all of that there is conflict that exists, right? There's conflicts that exist because of relationships of exploitation between store owners and the broader community, and or there could be conflict and exploitation in those relationships. And so it's not about glossing over that, but I think where we can move beyond some of this us versus them dynamics is when we're able to take a wider lens and understand how racism is functioning systematically and systemically in a way that positions our communities in tension with each other as a product of the way capitalism and white supremacy and racial segregation and all of these other things are playing out among our communities. And so I think it's appropriate probably to transition into the conversation around cross-racial solidarity. What does solidarity building look like?
I think I mentioned this earlier in terms of centering, for non-Black people of color, centering your action, or centering it through Black-led movements, right? Like your action should be led by Black-led movements, and supporting those causes. And in terms of recent examples from the George Floyd incident, for what solidarity looks like, I think there was that incident in DC where the guy's first name is Rahul, where he housed a bunch, 100 protesters in his house overnight when a curfew was instituted. And this is on a fairly, nice neighborhood in DC, and he welcomed people into his home and housed and fed them while the state was enacting a curfew and violence on its people. Also, there was after in Minneapolis, when I believe it was the precinct, I don't know if it was the precinct, it was a police precinct that was lit on fire. There was a Bangladeshi restaurant that was at the time serving as a staging ground for medics, allowing people to, wash who were tear gassed, clean up and whatever, and also providing food to the protesters. And the fire from the precinct caught on fire, led to the fire, allowed the restaurant to catch on fire. And the message from the immigrant-owned Bangladeshi family was, it's okay, we'll be fine. We just want to make sure you are okay, and we want justice, right? That it was in support of those that were looking for justice for George Floyd. And I think those are examples of solidarity from, specifically the South Asian community in recent times.
So this is the example that I keep referring back to, right? This entire concept of yellow peril in support of Black power. Back in 1966, was it? I have notes, but it was in support of.
I think it's 1963.
It was in support of the Huey Newton, who was a political activist and revolutionary, who was also a co-founder for the Black Panther movement. And I think that, as I indicated before, this is probably the most intense situation in which there is strong, solid foundation for solidarity that has been exhibited that I think has not yet been repeated or reiterated. But I will note just as a recent example that the entire Akai Girlie situation, like when that went down in Brooklyn, ACLA had an action in which, I mean, all of the Asian attorneys in Brooklyn showed up in full force to protest the light sentence that was imposed. And it wasn't much of a, I guess, force just in terms of the numbers, but it was definitely like a strong showing of that solidarity.
Yeah, that's important. I think that's, that's a part of the history of the Attorneys of Color Caucus at the Legal Aid Society that, in the broader, union, that we have been doing this cross-racial solidarity building within our own ranks. It's a conversation that we need to be having internally, and also actions that we can be taking and organizing as a broader group. So I want to add a little bit to this conversation around cross-racial solidarity, because I think the historical piece of it is also important. And there's people like Vijay Prashad, who's written a lot about what he terms like Afro-Asian connections, and thinking more globally about the relationship between the Black liberation struggle in the US, but also struggles abroad. And it includes in Asia, but also, in South Africa and Palestine. But when we look at, if we want to focus on the Black and Asian connection, I immediately think about the anti-war movement here in the United States, and the role of people like MLK and the Black Panthers, and so many people and movements for Black liberation that were critical of US imperialism and the ways in which white supremacy is exported abroad. And so there's connections there, right, with Ho Chi Minh from Vietnam coming to the US and then going back. There's relationships that we can think about regarding the development and use of nonviolence between Gandhi and nonviolent movements in Asia, and how that kind of cross-fertilizes across borders. And so I think about like how Angela Davis frames Black liberation, and she talks about the idea of how we need to have intersectional movements, and she oftentimes connects Black liberation to the struggles of Palestinians, and I think it's important for us to not only think about how other communities take or borrow or are inspired by Black liberation, but the ways in which these movements are mutually reinforcing. And so understanding that Black liberation is more than just police brutality, it's more than just quote unquote mass incarceration, but it's about all the systems, whether it's capitalism or militarism, the military industrial complex, all of these things that come together in ways that are violent and brutalizing, not only in the United States, but also in the Philippines, right? Like the relationship between Donald Trump and the United States with militarizing the forces in the Philippines, and how they are brutalizing people there. So there's so many connections that I think can be made that is not only cross-racial solidarity here in the United States, but also across borders and also historically. And so, I also just wanted to uplift the name of Sophia Bukhari, and I didn't know that. So for those of you who don't know, she was part of the Black Panthers Party. She was a political prisoner, and she actually worked at Legal Aid, I think back in the 80s. And I actually learned about her through another webinar on Black Asian solidarity, where she was named and her story was uplifted, particularly her relationship with Asian American movement leaders like Yuri Kochiyama. And so I thought that that was a really important piece of history that doesn't get a lot of attention. Even at an organization like Legal Aid, I would I would hope that we would find ways to kind of uplift her legacy and the work that she's done as someone who, you know, fought for Black liberation, is a hugely important political figure. And then for me, and in terms of this conversation, thinking about when she was released from prison, the community that supported her obviously included the Black community, but it also included people like Yuri Kochiyama, who is oftentimes held up as this movement elder for Asian Americans and a model of what Asian American solidarity for Black liberation should look like. So I just wanted to also name that and share that piece of history that I thought was really amazing, and I wish more people knew about it.
Well, and then also I think I watched the same panel that Jason's talking about, but with Sophia Bukhari, when she was released, she went to just the story of, she showed up at Yuri Kochiyama's door and she gave her a coat and some money, and it was just like, I don't know where she went. I gave her what she needed. And I think that again is an example of solidarity. And then I also learned that like Yuri Kochiyama later like converted to Islam. And I didn't know that she was there when Malcolm X was assassinated, you know, and it's just, you know, seeing Asian American leaders in the Black liberation movement is a place to start when we're building on solidarity.
Yeah, and it's not to romanticize these relationships, and it's not to romanticize the history of Asian American organizing. I think just even more broadly, like, organizing is hard, organizing is difficult. There is conflict, there is tension, and part of building solidarity is about having shared struggle, but it's also struggling with each other. It's about having relationships of accountability where we're able to call each other in, when we're able to have really difficult conversations and not pretend like everything's just going to be rosy and that we're just going to all get along, or that we're going to be best friends, or we're going to just like each other. It's not about a kumbaya moment. It's about shared struggle. It's a shared struggle against white supremacy, but it's also a shared struggle with each other, and to hold each other accountable in ways that are loving and compassionate.
And I just want to also highlight, it's also about addressing an accountability, because there is, I think you had touched upon it a little bit earlier, but, and I know some of the comments in the chat about sort of, you know, affirmative action and the Asian American role in that, and how, you know, you had the, I forget, you know, Becky with the bad grades, the case, but having white conservative groups find an Asian American plaintiff to push, you know, anti-affirmative action, you know, bring a case, and what does that look like? And also the notion that, you know, that like, oh, Asian Americans are denied a seat or admission, and, you know, they have high test scores. And, you know, I know, Jason, you've done a lot of work with testing in New York City public schools, but, you know, and talking about that, because it isn't, as Jason said, it isn't this kumbaya and just looking at those moments of solidarity. It's also acknowledging that, you know, there are moments and, you know, existing now that are problematic, that, you know, create the tension that we do need to address. And, you know, for those looking to work on social justice issues, and the movement for, you know, and in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement against, you know, police brutality, mass incarceration, and a whole host of other issues, it is important to, you know, acknowledge that those tensions continue to exist, and working, you know, to break that down as part of what solidarity looks like.
Yeah, and I would just flag for people, check out Mari Matsuda. She gave a speech back in the late 80s, early 90s called "We Will Not Be Used," and she talks about how Asian Americans are used as a racial wedge, and how it is our duty to resist that. And so she's someone that I draw a lot of inspiration for, and I basically borrow her ideas for my op-eds, but also, like, she's someone who was in, you know, not that everything's all about like academia or Harvard, but she was at Harvard with Kimberl Crenshaw and a lot of the Black activist scholars who formed critical race theory, the movement, and the field of critical race theory. And I think for myself, I wouldn't be here without without the work and the people like Kimberl Crenshaw, who's a mentor of mine, and people like Mari Matsuda, who struggled in solidarity with people like Kimberl Crenshaw. And so, and there's like so many other names that we can name across different fields and practices in the law, and across, outside of the law. But I just wanted to share that also as a resource because she's written a lot about some of these dynamics, and I think her perspective as an Asian American is also really useful. So it's we're kind of rounding towards the end of the panel portion. We want to leave room for everyone to participate in a broader dialogue. We don't want to just talk at you for this entire time. So I just wanted to, open it back up to the panel in terms of, are there any kind of takeaways or specific actions you want other Asian Americans or non-Black people more broadly, or non-Black people of color more broadly to think about in terms of what they could do, how they should think about this moment? Anything you want to share before we open it back up to the broader participants to hear from them?
So I was actually watching Hassan Minhaj's Patriot Act the other night, and it addressed George Floyd's murder to the South Asian community and why it should matter to the South Asian community and what to do. And originally, I think when we were preparing for this, one of the things that I found somewhat, problematic, especially when you're coming from, like Asian Americans. I'm really bad with statistics, but they're fairly wealthy. They're like the wealthiest minority. And so in terms of like Hassan Minhaj's suggestion was like, if you're a lawyer, you should be taking pro bono cases to, protesters. And it's assuming that all of us are corporate lawyers, and if you're in IT, helps, small business owners, and assuming that like that one volunteering like does not create the issue of technology in certain, like the lack of technology in certain communities. And it was this moment of sort of an erasure of the work of Asian Americans that came before us in solidarity. Like, when I went to law school, learning about Vanita Gupta, who had, worked at the ACLU and uncovered, all like in Tulia, Texas, where there was a sheriff's office that planted evidence and basically undid all of these convictions. And assuming that all South Asians or, Asian Americans work at corporate firms, suggesting that all doctors are not already working in underserved communities or spending time, in those hospitals and providing aid. And so I feel like, buying, like, suggestions of what to do, like by all means, if you're wealthy, donate money to Black-led movements. But I also think, asking folks who do the work what they should do is more powerful than, relying on, I don't want a corporate lawyer to take a pro bono case who has no experience. Like, that's not what, what your work should be. Maybe using your firm to, the resources your firm has to aid those actually doing the work. So he was definitely, oh, and I'm sorry, thank you, Stephanie. Vanita Gupta was working at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, not ACLU. But I think that, folks that do, social justice work are related to and friends with folks that don't do this work, but also, mobilizing them in ways that actually matter, and not just, I did this one pro bono case, but actually thinking about moving forward in creating or recreating a world that's more just, because his ideas that he suggested at the end of the show still bought into a very capitalist, throw money at the situation, volunteer for an hour at a week, which what we're seeing is not a solution to the many problems that COVID and George Floyd exposed. And it also was kind of jarring to see that he was so shocked because, especially, you know, this wasn't the first time. Like we saw Rodney King being assaulted by officers on video and nothing happened. You know, Breonna Taylor was killed in her home for doing absolutely nothing. And Tony McDade, you know, a Black trans person, was also killed and not uplifting. You know, it was just kind of like George Floyd and just erasing the work that's how like Asians have done in solidarity. And, you know, I think he was specifically speaking to a very, very, very specific audience. But I just found it, you know, his solutions were still tied up in the problem, right? Like it wasn't stepping away from it, which I think that, I mean, we're speaking to legal aid lawyers, so, you know, we're not really going to be the ones that are like making these large donations, but just thinking about ways that we can, which actually tackle what's endemic and problematic in the world that we live in.
I think
in response to that, sorry, Jason, in response to that though, we may be legal aid attorneys who are not going to be the ones who like contribute large financial sums, but we are also subject to possibly like perpetuating the issues. Right?
No, absolutely.
Problematic that needs to be addressed.
Yeah,
No.
Kim Mitchell or Jenman, I don't, because you're in Decarceration, the Police Accountability Project, like, do either of you want to talk about prison abolition or the abolitionist movement? And I know that, you know, legal aid, you know, some of us would love to see legal aid more align itself with the abolitionist movement. And for some people, that's not, they don't think that that makes sense, or they're skeptical. And some people think, you know, we just need more reform. We just need to tweak the law. We just need more anti-bias training. And I know, you know, we've gestured at the idea of like addressing root causes of harm, which I think requires us to have, you know, to at least name prison abolition and abolitionist like thinking and teaching and demands as part of as part of the conversation.
Yeah, I would really like to see, I mean, I think what it really is that like, in our practice, so much of our practice is wrapped up in harm reduction, but I think that we have to remember the context of placing that within a framework of abolition as like that overarching goal. That overarching framework has to be for abolition, I think. Knowing that a lot of our work on a day-to-day basis may only be reduced to harm reduction, if that makes sense. And I think that can cause some conflict and tension as well. I'm sorry, my cat keeps coming into the frame. But I think that it's important that we remember what the framework is and then understand that, like, even though we are lawyers and that we are doing everything we can, as lawyers, I don't think that lawyers are really the ones who are driving the change in a movement. I think that as lawyers, our primary role is to support the movement and to support organizers and lift up what they're doing and lift up what policies we can. And so we do have a little bit of a limited area where our skill set is going to do the most good. But knowing that, we should understand what the larger goals are of the movement. And I think that I would love to see more of that in legal aid, you know, and I would love to see more of attorneys in legal aid who are from marginalized communities supporting each other more, whether it be something as small as in the trial offices, like, you know, specifically looking to mentor or specifically looking to, second seat someone who is a person of color as well. You know, it's just all these little things so that we can uplift each other in small ways and big ways and remember what the larger framework is that we're all working towards.
Yes.
It's tough to co-sign on that in its entirety, Jen, only because like we are public defenders, right? Like we're not here to have like this policy change implementation as like the backdrop as to what we do, how we do it. I'm a public defender. I represent my clients on an individual basis. I'm not thinking about like the impact that it's going to have on the totality of the clients who I represent on a year-end basis. That's not what I'm looking at. And it's really just difficult for me to, I guess, resolve those two issues. They're not even competing against each other, right? But they are separate in their objectives.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate like the perspective that you're bringing. I think like, you know, even the protest on Monday, it's public defenders for Black lives. And so there is a naming of public defenders, Black public defenders, but there's also a connection to the Black Lives Matter movement. And part of what we've heard from, you know, whether it's the network, Black Lives Matter Network or Movement for Black Lives, part of the demand that they put forth is an abolitionist one, right? To defund policing and to abolish prisons. And I wanted to just use the framework that Ruth Wilson Gilmore uses, who's a prison abolitionist and Black scholar activist. She calls a lot of what, you know, Jen Min and Mitchell, you've named as non-reformist reforms. And in other words, reforms that shrink the carceral system and thus continue to move us incrementally, in the words of abolitionist organizer Mariam Kaba, towards the horizon of abolition. And so I think that that's like a helpful framework that, you know, we have a particular role in our jobs as public defenders and legal services attorneys within the courts. But also it is still tied to this broader movement. And so decarceration, which is absolutely part of the movement for abolition, and as well as the work that you're doing, Jen Bin, and everyone else, right? Whether it's you're a public defender or trying to uplift Black lives in the context of housing, immigration, and across the board, it's not just around policing itself.
Right.
So before we open it up, I wanted to just uplift that we talked a little bit about intersectionality, maybe a little bit more indirectly, but Naila made this point around like Tony McDade and like Breonna Taylor and like uplifting, say her name and that dimension of who sometimes is left out. And I wanted to uplift Kimberl Crenshaw's work around intersectionality, where she recently talked about if Black lives really do matter, all Black lives have to matter. That means Black lives across gender have to be lifted up. And so I think when we talk about the struggles for Black liberation and any kind of struggles, whether it's the ways in which Angela Davis talks about intersectional movements or Kimberl Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, I think there's ways in which we have to think about who's marginalized within the marginalization. And I think there's a lot of possibility in that kind of organizing to connect across struggles, whether that's across borders or across identities and communities. And given that we're also in June, there's going to be a Pride event later this month, I also wanted to just acknowledge that it is Pride Month, and that you know, I've also heard some LGBTQ folks, particularly, you know, cis white gay professional men, talk about this idea of like, oh, it's such a bummer, like that all of this bad stuff is happening as if it wasn't happening, you know, since forever. But like that puts a damper on our Pride celebrations. And a friend of mine, James Sixmaster, wrote that it's not canceled in reference to Pride. It's being celebrated the way it would be every year if we actually honored its roots, under the radar and out in the open, with Black, queer, and trans people at its center calling the shots. And so Asians for Black lives, LGBTQ for Black lives, I think we have to think intersectionally across identities. So I just wanted to make that connection before we open it up now to the audience and to hear from our participants. So there's a couple ways we can do this. Mitchell, I don't know if you want to kind of just flag a couple of the questions. Maybe if you could read off like 2 or 3 of them at a time, we can address them in batches, and then the panelists can respond to whichever ones resonate with them. And then after we've done a couple of the questions, we can then open it up to the participants if we want to unmute folks so that they can participate more of a dialogue. And I want to just say for that portion of the dialogue, we want to center Black attorneys and other attorneys of color in this conversation before we open it up to our white colleagues and have everyone kind of join in. So Mitchell?
I'm going to combine a couple of these questions because I think they're relatively the same, just in terms of what your position and sentiments are when some Black organizers think that it's most useful in terms of forming solidarity for non-Black people to focus on their own communities instead of trying to work with theirs.
Can you read a couple of more questions and then we can let people respond?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks.
And do you think there are real systemic factors that steers groups into certain groups, or is it the immigrant community and families who are steering their children into fields they think are acceptable? And do you guys have any thoughts on the recent criticism of the phrase yellow peril in support of Black power? Members of the Black community have said that it falsely equates the oppression that the two communities have faced. They have also said that it centers Asian Americans when we should be focused on the Black community. And are any of your friends anti-Black? If so, how do you address it? How do you deal with others who call you a snowflake? What is a snowflake? What actions are you taking as an attorney to address racism against you and your POC coworkers? And then just essentially it.
So does anyone want to start us off?
So in terms of the sentiment that, if some Black organizers think the most useful form of solidarity would be for us to focus on our own communities instead of trying to work. I think that is an important action to work, within our own communities and educating, what does, if there are people like the concept of defunding the police, like what does that mean, and things like that. I think it's absolutely part of solidarity. And also just in terms of, to be very, for non-Black people of color, to not take up space, know where you are taking up space in situations and in Black-led organizations and things like that. So kind of being aware of that. And I think it goes into one of the questions that said, are any of your Asian friends anti-Black? In terms of, I can say that some of my South Asian family are anti-Black, and in terms of how do I address it, I call them out on it, talk to them, and in terms of, it's just letting someone know that what they said was problematic, what they said was racist, and why, and how do I, in terms of their feelings about me, I don't really care, and it's more just, working with someone to alter their view. Obviously, if you're talking to a young child who says something is going to be completely different with an adult, where you might just, a family member that you don't get along with, and it's known, but still working at that, and maybe that's something I need to work on to not shut people out and be dismissive, or but I think that it's important to let your perspective be known, especially in situations when it is family members and Asian friends who are probably not saying these things outside of what they consider a safe space.
I think we're all anti-Black. I think that, and I hear the question naming a particular form of anti-Blackness that needs to be called out or called in. And the kind of political education and relationship building that we need to do among our own communities. But I think we have to look internally within ourselves, within our families, within our broader communities, and go outward from there. And I think so often the ways we talk about racism, and it's not just Asian Americans, but in general, it's always this thing that's out there for those people. And I think we have to be able to acknowledge that it's systemic. So if it's systemic, if it's embedded in all of our institutions and it's the foundation of what this country is built on, then anti-Blackness is everywhere and it's in all of us. And so I think naming that isn't to say we all are participating in anti-Blackness in the same ways, but I think it suggests that to work against anti-Blackness is a constant struggle that we have to be invested in, and that's a long-term struggle. It's not just one thing that we do or one action that we take, but we have to constantly self-reflect and challenge ourselves, challenge the people around us and the communities, our elected officials, and so forth. And so I think it has to be, all of this has to bridge to the broader systems, even though there's obviously individual relationships and ways in which that plays out on the individual interpersonal level.
I think I just wanted to address this question about whether or not I had any anti-Black friends. No, but family, yes. And I think that the approach that I've taken with them has been, one, to educate myself so that I can educate them. Without that political education, they are unable to understand why their anti-Blackness is a problem. And so educating myself in order to be better able to educate themselves about the history of racism in this country and why it's problematic, and pointing out to them whatever it is that they say or do that might support that. That's how I deal with that. And I don't really care if they call me a snowflake, but I do think that it's important to continually educate ourselves in order to hold others in our world or our spheres or in our communities accountable, and to spread that education amongst them.
So I think we want to open it up unless anyone else wants to add anything. So let's get a stack going. If you would like to either ask a question, make a comment, just engage, just raise your hand in the chat function, and then we will start calling on people. Anyone want to jump in?
So I think I'm going to ask the question that was raised in the chat. What's your experience, if you feel comfortable disclosing, handling anti-Blackness at LAS and in the courts?
I mean, I have friends at Legal Aid who are, I've witnessed just the stuff that Black attorneys, they say that they experience. And I mean, I don't know what the right thing to do is, but it's always reaching out in somehow support. Like, obviously it depends on a situation, but checking in and seeing what I can do to support. A lot of times going to the person who is harmed is not always the best way, because they may not, they may be processing and whatever. And so it's like, every situation is different, but in terms of, like, I usually, like, my general way of doing it is asking how I can, or letting other people know to support this person. And, it's kind of like a weak answer. And if people have better examples, but
I think that's appropriate, right? Like, I think it's a very tough situation to find yourselves in when you just want to jump out of your skin to either respond to correct the behavior of somebody who's like harming somebody that you care about, and also acknowledging the person you care about has a completely different viewpoint as to how that situation should be handled. I get it.
I think it's actually a lot easier in situations where it's sort of inner office, where you can sort of show support, stand up for, in different ways, supporting, a Black colleague over a white colleague, or a colleague of color in situations, or stepping, just certain things where you're not creating further harm to the person. And I think being cognizant of that is really important.
I think that actually ties into one of the questions that was asked earlier in terms of the value of performative alliance, and the way in which, like, if there's no actual meaning behind it, is it still worth doing? I mean, my answer obviously is no, which is why I didn't pose a question to the rest of you, but you guys chime in.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like activism now with like Twitter and Instagram, you know, especially if you, you know, aren't used to doing a lot of Instagramming or Twitter, there's like a lot of activism can be seen as performative, you know, saying like, oh, I was there. And I agree with Mitchell, like if it is just performative, why even bother? At the same time, I think like Twitter is extremely useful when you go back to like the Arab Spring. These things are extremely useful for organizing. So I don't want to diminish them, but there are times where you just, you know, when you, just because you posted a, you know, a Black Lives Matter thing on your Instagram in solidarity, it's like, is that the only, like, is that it? And what else are you doing? And I think, yes, I do think if it's performative, if it's true, like, no one's gonna call what they do performative, right?
I think the way that I think about this is, whether it's on the individual level or as Legal Aid as an organization, or, you know, any employer or company, who are we accountable to? So when we say Black Lives Matter, who are we accountable to? Are we accountable to Black communities? Are we accountable to Black struggles? And I think the way a lot of people talk about solidarity, it's solidarity with, not solidarity over, right? So we're not telling people, Black people, it's not about non-Black people telling Black people what to do or what they need, but how do we support those movements? How do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we actually give decision-making power to Black communities, to Black colleagues, to Black leadership? And so I think that that's an important framing of that question.
Eugene?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Hi, so yeah, I just had a few things I want to just bring up to all of you, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts. I think it's just, especially with regards to the Yellow Peril Supports Black Power, like one of the things that I've kind of really discussed this with people I know, like the other Asian friends I have, and you know, like Black Panthers and Huey Newton, they're very supportive of communism, and like I think you mentioned earlier, like Ho Chi Minh. I think he visited China to meet Mao. He was friendly with like Fidel Castro and Kim Il-sung in North Korea. So like I guess like it's kind of, I don't know what your thoughts are, but for me personally, I think it's difficult for a lot of Asian people to kind of reconcile, I guess, some of these ideas because of like their families left their countries because of war, you know, due to communism. At least this is what I've been hearing from other people. That's one thing I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are on. The other thing that I guess you kind of touched on was like the performative nature of that slogan itself, because there is criticism from people that it kind of shifts, or it seems like it shifts the focus onto Asian people rather than like the Black struggle. And then I guess also I was just curious what your thoughts are on the slogan in terms of sorry, just let me collect my thoughts for a second here.
That's really good. Maybe we can just start by answering some of them, and if you want to add more questions for the panelists, we can do that.
Sure.
I think that the first question really goes to like it goes back to what we were saying earlier about how Asian Americans aren't a monolith, and how there's so many different kinds of Asian Americans, different groups of Asian Americans, and how there's so many different experiences within the Asian American experience itself, and how you know, there isn't really one way to define us, and so I think that it just means that we like, I don't know if we need to reconcile it necessarily, because I think that we need to look to where we are in the present and understand that, you know, when we say Black Lives Matter, we mean we're talking about the state violence that is being inflicted upon Black communities. So we might not need to really go into all these other intricacies. I don't know if that, I don't know. I'm just sort of spewing. And as far as the performative nature, I agree with everyone that like the performative aspect of it, without any, I mean, if it's just performative, then like don't, like why bother, right? Because there's nothing behind it. There's no actual action behind it. There's no actual accountability. But I guess the other thing that I was thinking about is whether there is some value in the performative at all. And I mean, that's, I don't know. I mean, again, like, I don't think it's really worth it if if there's nothing behind it, but like, is there any value to the performative nature in any way?
I think part of the challenge of that question is how do we define performative? And if it's a critique of social media activism, I think it depends, right? Because especially in the disability rights movement, social media has been a way to make political organizing more accessible. And I think about the work of Mia Mingus and Alice Wong. And there's a lot, and even now, you know, in the context of the pandemic, there's so much that's happening in terms of digital organizing. And so I don't think it's necessarily a critique of that, right? I think what I'm hearing about the performative piece of it is like an influencer just posting a picture in front of whatever and not doing anything with it and not really leveraging their power and privilege in ways to support the broader movements. And so I think it's a question of it depends. And I think in the context of social media, so many community organizing groups and campaigns, they actually have digital media campaigns. So look at what they're doing and amplify it. Like literally, like Movement for Black Lives, they had a week of action. You don't need to come up with your own action, people. Like follow their lead and amplify what they're doing. Regarding the first question around kind of the broader histories and like political context that our families and communities come from, I think, you know, there are real challenges there, and a part of that is the propaganda that the U.S. imperial state white nation building project has exported abroad, where we understand things like communism or socialism in these particularly negative and violent ways, but we don't understand capitalism in the mainstream context in that kind of way, even though capitalism is what produces the prison industrial complex, that produces racial inequality, that is the underpinning of slavery and land theft in this country. And so I think, I mean, that's not an answer I'm necessarily gonna start the conversation with my parents, who, you know, went through the Cultural Revolution in China, but I think it is a way to think about how do we reframe some of how do we reframe the conversation? Where are we starting as a baseline in terms of how we understand what's a problem, what's not a problem, who's the problem, who's not the problem, who has power, who doesn't have power. And I think that's where some of the abolitionist organizing is really powerful, because it's a complete reframing of how we think about investing in communities versus divesting in communities. And so that's just an example, but I think it's about reframing some of the baselines and how we have the conversation. So I don't know if Eugene, if you wanted to ask another question.
Oh, yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah, I guess just, you know, seeing like the media, especially like I guess like the New York Times, since I do read it pretty frequently, it's, as you mentioned, it's very there is a lot of imperialistic propaganda and very anti-Chinese sentiments, especially recently. And I think like what you touched on, it is a very difficult topic to discuss with, I guess, the older generation. But I think even just for children of immigrants, like it's, especially I think people who are not as well informed. I mean, it's just, I guess, a struggle for me or discussions that I have even with my own friends, because, you know, like the NYPD, they're like running people over in the protests. And for me, it's like, I don't think that's very different from what happened in Tiananmen Square, or like, you know, suppression in the media and the news. It's like, well, America, these countries that America criticizes, like, we're doing the same thing over here. So I don't know. But anyways, thank you all for hosting this. It's good to see other Asian attorneys in our field that aren't DAs. So thank you. Hopefully we'll do more of this though.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, like, I think this might be a less radical answer that our parents are not going to want to hear. I think, like, if the concern is around authoritarianism, then let's look at authoritarianism right now in the United States. Let's look at what Trump is doing with militarizing the border. Let's look at what's happening in immigration detention. Let's look at what's happening in terms of the police response to protesters and kind of the violations of the First Amendment and free speech and all kinds of other kind of systemic abuses and violence that we're seeing experienced at the level of the state. And so I think, you know, if your concern is about authoritarianism, let's talk about what that looks like here in the United States. And so that is not just this like opining around like nationalist sentiments that some of our families may have about like the China or the Taiwan or the India or whatever it may be, but like let's actually have a nuanced conversation about what that looks like in practice here in the United States.
I'm gonna call on Dan.
So Dan, do you want to unmute yourself and jump right in?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is the correct Dan, right? Okay, hi folks. So thank you very much for the honesty of this discussion. I think it's very much needed, certainly at Legal Aid and everywhere else. So my question has to do with specifically Legal Aid, and you know, having seen events through the decades here, my impression has always been it's not necessarily intentional, but attorneys of color frequently develop a reputation very early on here. And I do think that has an impact on their retention, on their success in the organization, on where they end up. And that just is my personal, you know, feeling over seeing incidents over the years. And my question is whether you believe this has improved, you believe you have experienced this, and how do we address it? Because I just think there are always systemic factors, whether they're outside in society or internally in any organization, whether people mean it or not.
Dan, what do you mean by reputation? Like, what reputation are we building and creating for ourselves when we get to legal aid?
Well, I think in certain units, in my experience, is people very on, their word gets circulated about, oh, this person is like this, or this person is like, you know, is good at this. And I think some of those can be, you know, motivated by unintentionally just by, you know, possibly stereotypical factors that people have of certain groups in society. Mm-hmm. And my experience very early on, when there were units where men were far less diverse, is people tend to get reputations very early. And it's very hard for people who are, you know, small numbers to kind of advocate for themselves. Okay. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely does exist. I mean, for example, in a trial office, like a trial attorney, like a defense trial attorney looks like a tall white man, right? So if you're a woman of color, if you're a man of, you know, it's just like there are ideas that we have in our head that I think are still perpetuated. And I mean, I think in that experience where people are surprised at what you can handle, like, and it's like, I mean, these are kind of like microaggressions, but I think I've definitely experienced it at Legal Aid, where something that shouldn't be surprising was surprising. And, you know, I internalize in a way just because it's not the first time that's happened, but relating it to either race or gender. If that, I don't know if that's what you're speaking to.
Yeah.
Yes, and I can just say personally, I think there were early on in other areas where people would say, well, you know, this person possibly because of, you know, works really hard, okay, and oh, what group could that possibly? Or this person is really, you know, has good oral skills, okay, or leadership skills, or whatever it is, but for some reason they also happen to match stereotypical things about people, okay, based on their group identity. So I really am just interested, if people are having these kind of experiences still, how do we combat this? You know, are these issues relating to training issues, because some people may just learn differently, and I'm really more concerned about retention, about getting people, because lawyering is lawyering, right? And we want everybody, of no matter what background, to be doing their best. So how do we stop this kind of early identification of people and pigeonholing and moving people all onto the same level of excellent lawyer?
Listen, legal aid isn't insulated from the rest of the world, right? Like, we're still going to be subject to exact same like levels of racism and oppression as we would outside of these doors. My class had a really massive number of critical mass of people of color. There was a mass exodus of the women of color just for the last, 4 years now, that we raise it insofar as we say, like, this is a problem. Like, let's do something in order to make sure that the people who are here feel comfortable enough to want to stay here, try to work through whatever issues that they're feeling in order to want to stay here. We don't do that.
Yeah, I agree. It's a much bigger issue that, you know, we don't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't mean that there aren't critiques and demands to be made, which ACLA and Mala and the LGBTQ caucus have been raising, right? So it's about how do we center racial justice in the work that we do, so it's not an afterthought. How do we think about bias in the workplace so that it's part of the everyday conversation and not a one-off training? Just like, you know, we can criticize the police departments that, you know, anti-bias training is oftentimes ineffective and a waste of money. Part of that, it's not to say that, you know, trainings don't work, but it can't just be a one-off thing. It has to be part of a broader set of changes to our organizational culture and institutional practices. And so I think, you know, the work of the unions through the caucuses is a big part of that. And I will say, you know, I do feel like in recent years that I do think management has been more open to hearing from the caucuses, right? And like, I think, you know, we want it to be more than just a conversation, though. We want to actually make sure that translates into concrete action, as we saw in the Bala statement, which really laid out a clear critique and a set of demands. And so I think, you know, these are ongoing conversations that we have to keep on having. It's like Angela Davis says, freedom is a constant struggle. And so, like, we have to be in it for the long haul. We have to be persistent. We have to be unrelenting. And so I think, you know, that's the work that we also have to all do collectively. So it's not just, you know, 2 or 4 ACLA reps or, you know, a couple of BALA reps making the case. This is something that we all organizationally have to be invested in. So that's why, you know, that's why we're having this event, so that we can talk about the role of non-Black people of color, right? How can we support Black liberation, including at Legal Aid? And so it's up to all of us. And so, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Jesse?
Hey guys, thanks so much for having this panel. So I just wanted to ask a question. Do you feel that as attorneys of color who are trying to support Black Lives Matter and the effort to overthrow white supremacy, do you feel that we specifically have a duty to speak, like, with an emphasis on our identity as Asian Americans? Partially because I personally feel that when I do speak, I feel like willingly or not, I am inevitably speaking in a way on behalf of Asian people, specifically Asian American women, and cognizant of the fact that we do have solidarity issues within our own community, especially across generational divides, whether that be an age generation gap or an immigration status generation gap. Certainly some, I would say, rather prominent segments of our community have decided that, you know, for their own survival or whatever, that aligning themselves with white supremacy would, as like the ideal way to assimilate and try to get the best for themselves within the society. And that's why I do feel like some segments, as a reaction to Black Lives Matter, have felt personally threatened because they've based some of their sense of liberation on aligning with white supremacy within this kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy of living as the model minority, which, you know, as we've discussed, was just something that was constructed to collapse solidarity. So I'm curious on your views as whether we, in our advocacy and personal lives, do we have a duty specifically to emphasize our Asian American identity?
Yeah, so I'm hearing the question as kind of like, when do we organize under the umbrella of people of color? When do we speak from a subject of position as people of color more broadly? And when is it appropriate to actually name when we're organizing under the banner of being Asian American? And also when we're talking about the struggles of racism and white supremacy, when is it appropriate to name Black people, the Black experience, Black struggle? And so that's what I'm hearing as the question. Does anyone want to kind of take up that question?
Yeah.
So, and also, Zamir, if you want to jump in, you're welcome to also respond to that question.
So allyship, I think, necessarily requires an understanding and a self-awareness around like power and privilege, right? And there's obviously inherently a racial hierarchy in this country, and with the objective of being equity and inclusion, in order for us to actually be allies in any kind of genuine capacity, we have to identify ourselves as Asians because of the fact that we understand the privilege that we have being in this position. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, also, I mean, I don't like in terms of identifying as Asian, I mean, looking at the folks in like our appearance and our name, right? Like when we speak, when we do something. And I think this is also sort of, and I guess I'm not really following the question, but to me, it's like my identity doesn't matter when I mean, my action shouldn't center around my identity if it's an action towards like Black Lives Matter, right? And in the same way, if an action that I'm doing, if it's like in solidarity with immigrants' rights or another, like it's I guess, and that goes to sort of when it's not about me, a situation that's not about me. And I think going back to the comment on something being performative, I agree with Jason that, you know, social media is a great tool to mobilize. The number of letters that were sent to council members, the city comptroller and things like that is amazing. But I do think there is an issue when something becomes performative, where, and I define it where your advocacy, your action, it becomes more about you than the work, like if that makes sense. And it's like not to, like if you have ideas for an action, obviously mobilize and create around those. And I think for anyone who's non-Black and non-Black people of color, we do have to be conscious that we don't make our work in solidarity with social movements for Black liberation about us. And in ways of like, you know, Yuri Kochiyama wasn't, I mean, she didn't have Instagram at the time, but it's just kind of like, how much is it so people can see what we're doing and what type of actions we're actually doing that actually impact change. And obviously all of those organized social media movements, like the Arab Spring was able to happen because of Twitter. It was huge. So I don't mean to be dismissive at all of social media, but I do think we do need to be cognizant of where we center ourselves, and if it just becomes more about us in this moment where, where all of your friends are posting this, but you don't really one doesn't have a handle on what it means. Like, look at what certain things mean. Learn, like, what does it actually mean to defund the police? And if it makes you uncomfortable, figure out what it means and address your fears around it, I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it depends. So I think there are times where it's appropriate to organize and to speak as a person of color and use that. I certainly do. And I think there are times where if you're talking about Black people, then just say, we're talking about Black people and name that experience, right? And so I think, to me, for a lot of us, maybe that, we go to college and then we go to predominantly white, some of us go to predominantly white institutions where we were introduced to this kind of terminology around people of color. And so I think there is power in saying, there's people of color, that there is like a third world struggle, a third world liberation movement. But I think there's also times where it is absolutely appropriate and the right thing to center the Black experience and what we're doing and talking about. And so I think it just depends. And I think, sometimes, it's not always clear, and, you work through it. And sometimes people will call you out and they'll say, like, it's not really like your time to be speaking on this. This is like this is our thing. And so if you want to support, this is the way you should do it. And so I think, it's a process and it's situational. Does anyone want to else jump in before we open it up to, I think?
And I just want to echo what you were saying. A lot of this is situational because it's going to be different every time, right?
And you know what? We've been talking about like Asian and Black as separate categories, but there are also people who are Black and Asian. And so I also don't want to erase that experience and that intersectional identity. And so there are people who exist at the intersections of both identities.
Yeah.
So Mitchell, should we open it up to some of the remaining questions or comments?
Yeah, Ashna.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse.
Hi. I just had a question. Earlier in this discussion, you mentioned that a great way to think about this is if for those of us who are Asian Americans, to ensure that our solidarity is sort of led by or informed by Black movements. Do you have any suggestions then on how we can conceptualize of justice if we believe in something like decarceration or prison abolition, but are seeing Black folks on social media or organizers call for prosecution of cops for racist killings? Is that, do you have any thoughts, or are there any resources we should be checking out? Because I think just considering the tension in that discussion.
So I mean, this is really hard because we're like, if you're, abolitionist calling for the prosecution and imprisonment of the cops goes against that idea. But we are right now, but in the framework that we operate now, that's where we're at. And I would just, going back to sort of Peter Liang, he was probably the first cop in New York City to ever be convicted, despite Eric Garner's murder was caught on video as well. And he got probation, and Legal Aid did protest in front of the district attorney's office because, and it wasn't he should go to jail, it was the framework of our clients should be getting the same leniency, right? And so centering, I guess, that framework is really important to push, similar to the Stanford rape case. He got probation. A judge saw promise with his privilege, right? I don't know many instances where a Black man is convicted of raping an unconscious woman behind a dumpster would have gotten probation, right? So it's sort of like when you center the conversation around, like, I guess that's how one would center the conversation around decarceration, right? And I think given that we are operating, like, and again, it goes back to reimagining, like when you're going into what abolitionist looks like, it's coming back to, well, it would operate, I believe, in not living under a police state, which is what we have now, right? The officers, like, there was state violence. So I guess that, like, that's how, I don't know, that's how I would sort of answer that.
Yeah, I appreciate that response because, like, part of the example you gave around how our clients are experiencing the criminal justice system or punishment system brings into focus a systemic racism analysis and demand on the state. So it's not just about, you know, individual prosecution and bad apples, but all of the ways in which the criminal legal system plays out in racist kind of ways. And I put in the chat a link to a piece that Mariam Kaba wrote, who is a Black prison abolitionist, where she says prosecuting cops does not equal justice. And so I don't think, you know, I need to say as an Asian American, like, what Black people should do or how they should understand what justice and accountability looks like within any particular individual circumstance. But I would say that I'm guided by the work of Angela Davis and Mariam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and all of, you know, Critical Resistance and all the Black abolitionist organizing that has addressed that issue. And so Black people are also not a monolith, just like Asian Americans aren't a monolith, and there's competing views and perspectives. And a lot of that, you know, as we talked about earlier, is about the ways in which we internalize anti-Black racism. And that's something that goes across communities of color, and also within Black communities. Like, we're not gonna take advice or guidance or leadership from Clarence Thomas on what the criminal legal system should look like or not look like, right? We know where that's gonna get us. That's not gonna get us to Black liberation. And so I think it's about where, you know, there are Black voices that are leading, and those, you can choose who you wanna follow. And so I follow Angela Davis and Mariam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore in Critical Resistance.
You know, I think that we reflect the broader society that we exist in, right? There's so many of us that just aren't capable of engaging in difficult conversations without distancing ourselves from the person that we disagree with, otherizing people. So I guess I have a proposal, so to speak. I think there are groups and people, for example, like people who do restorative justice, who are intentional about the framework that they're using when they have difficult discussions. So maybe our unions or the affinity groups within it could have sort of an agreed set of principles to work through, or that, you know, that framework, so that when we're having these conversations, the tone, like, you know, we can all sort of point back to these shared set of goals. So it's not that we're necessarily policing people's expressions of their frustrations or disagreements, but that when you come to the table to have these difficult discussions, we have a shared set of principles that we're operating under. We are not adopting colonial, you know, values of canceling, otherizing, and distancing ourselves from our brothers and sisters because we have a disagreement. So maybe that is something that all the, you know, the different groups can kind of work together. And when we bring it to, you know, other settings, whether it's management, whether our white colleagues need to follow our lead in that regard, it has something to move all of us forward. We have something to move us all forward when we have these difficult discussions. That's all.
Thank you. That's a good suggestion. Any of the panelists want to say in closing? Is there a takeaway you want to share with the participants?
I mean, I guess in this moment, just do whatever you can, because it is a really important moment, and I am hopeful considering the calls that are being made for actual structural change. So I would encourage that, and then also encourage, you know, talking to your communities, especially. I know someone made a comment about folks focusing on the looting aspect and having those conversations. I think there might be, Jason, an email follow-up to those that attended for resources, because there was a request in that. So if that could be included. But yeah, that's the sort of takeaway that I would.
Great.
Only takeaway I have, thank you for everyone for coming and listening and participating. Thank you to all the other panelists. And the only takeaway I have here is that, we have to continue doing the work. We have to continue having the difficult conversations within our communities and with ourselves. And I think that's how we continue to move forward.
Thank you.
My only takeaway is this: what's happening right now, it is a mutiny for survival, and it necessarily requires that you be present.
Thank you, Mitchell. So I want to thank all of our panelists, Naila, Mitchell, Jenvin. Thank you, Zamir, for opening this discussion. Thank you to all of the participants. Thank you to the Attorneys of Color Caucus of ALAA for helping to organize and presenting this, I think, very much needed dialogue. I hope this is not the last one. I hope we continue these conversations. And also, it's not just conversation that we're having, but this is the foundation of doing more organizing. And we're gonna have to continue to build off of these conversations. And we need to translate this into action. And so, even as this news cycle changes, which it's already starting to do, we need to commit and recommit to the struggle for Black liberation, to challenge racism and white supremacy. There's a role for all of us. And so I also just want to flag as another resource, Deepa Iyer, who's written about different roles that people can play in social movements. I also hyperlink it. It's hyperlinked in the op-ed that I wrote that was distributed. So you can also look through that piece for other resources and articles if you want to do more reading. And so that's all I have. And I just want to again thank all of you for taking the time. And we went half an hour over because there's a real commitment here to have these difficult conversations and to lay a foundation where we can build and support our Black colleagues and the work for Black liberation. So thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.